So now that we've learned about the different triads, seventh chords, and their inversions, we're going to look at a few examples of how they are used. The goal of this lesson is to get you using most of the chords as quickly as possible. Now we'll worry about the theory of chord progressions and part writing later in the course. So what I've done here is create a basic chord progression that hits most of the chords in the diatonic scale. If you glance over it, you'll see 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7 chords are all used. The goal of this and other basic chord progressions I'm going to present in this course is to show you characteristic examples of how these chords are used in the context of a chord progression or a theme. By seeing these examples and transforming them, you're going to learn much more than if I were to just tell you that 1 can lead to 5 or 6 or 1, 6 or anything like that. So I'll try to make these basic chord progressions as useful as possible for you. Feel free to use them in your own pieces and to change them around, add to them, subtract from them, but at least you have a point to start from. So by now, there shouldn't be anything in this chord progression that doesn't look at least familiar. So let's listen to it, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what's going on. So we start off on a 1 chord, and this chord is in root position with a 3 in the soprano. Sounds like this. Now together with the other notes in the chord, it's considered a complete chord. You've got the C, and that C is doubled. You got a G, and then you've got an E, which is the third. Note the spacing of the notes. Each note occupies a certain range, each named after the different voices of a choir. So you have soprano on top, alto, tenor, and bass, also sometimes called SATB. The soprano line is the top line, and the alto is the second, tenor is the third, bass is the fourth. We'll go over these ranges and the specifics of these different voices later on in the course when we talk about part writing. Now, one thing you should note is the spacings. Between the upper voices, so the soprano and the alto, or the alto and the tenor, notes tend to be spaced closer together. Although this is actually pretty wide spacing. But between the tenor and the bass, you'll notice that these are an entire octave apart. The main reason for this, and you'll notice it throughout the rest of the chord progression, is because of the overtone series. Lower notes have more partials, which I'll explain this here in a second, but they have more partials that get excited when they're played. So if you play a low C, for instance, and you're not just hearing that low C, but you're hearing a bunch of other notes above it. Now I just played those. What you really don't hear all of them in that kind of strength as if I was playing them on the piano. It's really just almost minuscule amounts of the tone that's being excited, but it does affect the way it sounds. So if you were to play 2 really low notes together, like a C and an E, it gets real muddy and hard to recognize. But if you look at the spacing on the overtone series, where we have a low note, and then another octave above that is the C, then the G, then another C, then an E, G, B flat, C, and so on. If you stick with that spacing, it'll sound good. So if you look at this, that sounds really harmonious. And in fact, you can get away with a little bit closer. That's already a tenth apart. So it's important to pay attention to spacing, and it's not just for writing little piano pieces or doing SATB part writing. This is very valuable if you want to do orchestration, because the same concepts apply. If you've got 2 bassoons down at the bottom, doing this, it's going to sound muddy. But if you have them spaced a tenth apart, it sounds much cleaner. So let's keep on going. After the first chord, we move to a 5, which is a G chord in this case, and then to a minor 6, which is A minor, and then to a 1/6. So it sounds like this. This specific chord progression is very common in music and actually has a name. It's called a Romanesca, and variants of it have been used for hundreds of years. The one that you're probably most familiar with is this one. And that's Canon in D by Johann Pachelbel. Now, in our progression, note the ways in which the different voices move. Mostly stepwise or common tone movements, except the bass, which tends to jump around a little bit more because it's got to hit those different roots. Now from there, we move to a 4 chord and then to a 1/6 chord and then 2 to 5. And this 2/5 is called a half cadence, which we'll be talking about along with other cadences in Lesson 5 on functional harmony and chord progressions. So far, this whole progression is only 4 bars. Now note that the second part of the progression is also 4 bars. It's good to practice writing in segments of 2, 4, and 8 bars, as that gives your music a symmetrical and logical feel. Later on, we'll look at ways of expanding and contracting your music when we start to compose a piano sonata. But for now, work on music that's easily understandable both by you and by listeners. Now in the second part of the progression, we start with 1, we move to 7/6, which is a diminished chord, and then to 1/6. Now I want you to note how the melody moves down by step, but the bass moves up by step. And this is called contrary motion, and it's a great way to give a melodic line individuality. If you ever want to write a counter melody, you will need to learn how to use this and other kinds of melodic motion in your music. From there, we hold 1/6 for an entire bar, but change the bass by an octave. And then finally, we have a complete authentic cadence. This means that it has all of the elements of a cadence, which is an initial tonic, the 1/6 chord, a predominant chord, in this case a 2/6, the dominant chord, which is a 5/7, and then the tonic chord once again. It also ends with the first scale degree in the soprano, which makes it a perfect authentic cadence, which is frequently written as PAC or PAC. So this is basic chord progression number 1. Now what are we supposed to do with this though? Well, I want you to compose to it just like you did in Melody Part 1 with those chord progressions. But now I want to open up some more possibilities with what you can do with it. So first, let's look at how we can make each chord progression useful for a composer. Many a young college freshman hate doing their harmony and voice leading exercises. They look at something like this and say, well, this isn't music, it's just theory. How do we turn this into actual music? Well, I want to show you exactly how. We won't stray too far from the path of the original chord progression because I don't want to overwhelm you, but hopefully this should be relatively enlightening. First off, if you look at this progression, the first thing that should stand out is it's kind of difficult to play on the piano. Chord spacing like this is just too large for normal hands to play. So we should transpose this to something called keyboard style. Keyboard style basically limits the top 3 voices to a spacing of 1 octave and puts them all on the top staff, leaving just the bass line on the bottom staff. In keyboard style, we're writing our chords in closed position, which means there's no way to fit an additional chord tone between voices. This makes them easy for one hand to play. And, it's not an unbreakable rule, as in certain cases it sounds better to have a little bit of space. For instance, look at the 1/6 chord here, where we're not doubling the E, which is in the bass. This open sound on top still sounds very nice and is playable by one hand. You're still limiting it to 1 complete octave. Basically, to turn this original one into keyboard style, I kept the original soprano line, and then I built the chords spaced in thirds or fourths or whatever underneath. There are a few exceptions, But what's more important is that you listen to what you're writing, and if you think it sounds good, you need to keep it. So let's listen to what this sounds like in keyboard style. Now that we have it in keyboard style, we can play around with it a little bit more. In this next example, what I do is I take that keyboard style and then I turn it into a very common type of piano accompaniment. With the exception of changing octaves, I haven't changed the notes on anything. I leave the melody in the soprano, and then the rest of the chord tones I put in the left hand. So let's go ahead and listen to what this sounds like. Now it's already looking a little bit more convincing as a real piece and not just a chord progression. In this last example, what I do is I take some more freedom with the left hand, and I use what's known as an Alberti bass line, or this kind of figure played, you hear it a lot in Mozart and a lot of classical pieces. And all I'm doing is I'm splitting up the chord. Instead of playing all the chord tones at once, I just split them up. I also add additional chord tones and non-chord tones to the melody, just like we did in Melody Part 1. So let me go ahead and play this last variation. Now this may seem a little bit overwhelming to you, but in reality, you're starting with a really good foundation with this basic chord progression. So for this lesson, your exercise is to take that same chord progression and then turn it into keyboard style just like I did, and then once you've done that, use it to compose your own variations on it. Try different accompaniment figures than I did, or add different notes to the melody. Pretty much change it as much as you like, but without changing the underlying harmony or structure of the piece. I think you'll find that there's a lot that you can do. Look at this as a theme and variations, just like any classical composer would do. You're starting off with your theme, which is this basic chord progression, and then you're going to do variations on it as many times as you'd like. So I hope you enjoy the exercise.